state they will never be able to put back. So rather than falling into this trap and not knowing what to do, we should prepare ourselves for when that comes. And when it comes, be ready and be able to continue living as we are. So what are we actually talking about in this debate? Well, there are two major things that need definitions, and these are what climate change prevention has been, and also what we are supposed to focus on, namely what climate change adaptation is. Now, climate change prevention takes place in several ways and in several aspects in our world right now. It takes place in the legislative quotas placed on capitalist firms, putting quotas on their CO2 emissions and so on. It places higher costs on families and their electrical usage and the usage of their water. And moreover, it places a huge political pressure on our politicians for them to have to focus on the issues of climate change and have it debated, even though it is such a polarized question within the political spectrum. And now, what is climate change adaptation, on the other hand? Climate change adaptation is fully accepting that climate change is moving towards an end, an irreversible end that we can never get back, that we cannot stop climate change, and in 20 years, the methane gases currently frozen in the tops of Siberia will dissolve and we will be entrenched in a sea of CO2, never being able to go back to the state we are in today. So we're moving towards that threshold. And so climate change adaptation is dealing with the problems that this huge CO2 emission and this break in greenhouse gases will connote. These problems include an increase in temperatures around the world. It includes an increase in higher sea levels, but most of all, it includes in a change of the way our atmosphere works, in a change of what gases will be, and completely radicalize the way life can work in such an issue. So we place the burden on our side today that since when this threshold is reached, the climate and the environment of our world will change in such a drastic way that the way we live our lives today won't be sustainable, won't be able to be continued, and we will, in essence, not be able to continue living as we do now. So if we prove that it is not sustainable, that after this threshold it won't work, we need to rather adapt to when that time comes and then be ready to continue living in the way that works. So moving on to my first substantive, and here I'll be talking about, firstly, ethically, why it has failed and why climate change prevention has failed. Moreover, proving how empirically this has happened in our world, and finally, talking about why it is so much better that we focus on climate change adaptation and why we're wasting our time right now talking about climate change prevention in the political spectrum and in our population. So moving on, why it is principally not working. Well, there are two major ways our governments and our societies always try to prevent climate change prevention. And this is firstly on the corporate level of corporate organizations, and secondly on trying to propagate this to the regular people and to the way regular people work. So why hasn't this worked in the way of corporate organizations? Well, corporate organizations in our world today are fueled by very strong capitalistic forces that do not know means of end. They do not know means of saving our environment. The only way and the only thing they strive for is the best, cheapest means of production. And unless they don't get this, they do not pay attention to anything else. We see these companies being able to lobby against quotas in place on them, against government quotas in place on them, fighting for the environment. And we see that they transcend these, they go around these, and therefore it is not working in principally in corporations. And secondly, why isn't it working with the average person and the average family living in the world? Well, what people like that, what families and regular single living people in apartments and houses are susceptible to, is change. If they see that there's a change currently affecting them and drastically affecting them, they will take measures. But climate change, it's so slow, it's so gradual, that even though there is climate change, the increases in temperatures in our houses are by 0.01 degrees Celsius. We don't take notice of this, and therefore we do not take action towards the opening.
Okay, so if that is the case, why will people also want to adapt to climate change, and why will people want to move away from their homes and go to other places?
Thank you, because soon we know that we're reaching this drastic point where our environment will change in such a way that we will no longer be able to sustain life. We can educate these people that in 20 years there will be this huge change in climate change. And if they see this, if we prove that they see this, people will then take a step towards adaptation, because adaptation does not take place in the regular form of family. No, adaptation starts with scientific development. Adaptation starts at the corporate level. Adaptation does not start with taking action as a family. So we don't care if the families see or don't see a climate change. We say that adaptation will start at a higher level, and then when the drastic change in climate change eventually comes, the regular people will be able to take this adaptation that was developed by the corporations and scientists that actually see the harms and results of climate change. So, no, thank you. And empirically, we've also seen this, that climate change hasn't worked. We still see a 2% increase in temperatures average around the entire world. We see 2 degrees Celsius increase every year in countries around the equator. Climate change prevention hasn't worked. It's only exacerbating the problem. So we, on our side of the house, propose that we adapt instead, and instead accept as educated scientists. We want the educated scientists to stop wasting time, stop wasting debating time, and stop wasting complex time on how to solve prevention, because this is not working. We want them to adapt to the future. Thank you. We want them to focus on how developing crops that will work in warm conditions, because we've done this before. We've been able to move our crops, the crops we have in Europe down to Africa. We've been able to do this, so we can develop this. We want them to put money on technology that is working with CO2 emissions, on technology that is able to convert this and work on this as their fuel. We've also been able to do this in the way we see that cars change into hybrids, etc. We want them to build sustainable facilities and sustainable houses and sustainable structures in countries that will be affected by the higher sea levels. We've seen this before. We've seen this happening in countries such as Holland and Belgium, which are already susceptible to floods. We see this work, and we want to prepare our society as a whole, as we do for natural disasters in Indonesia, as we do for natural disasters in Haiti. We want a similar process to be done all around the world, because soon the natural disaster of irreversible climate change will come, and we've not been able to prevent it, and therefore we need to adapt and get ready for when it comes. And that is why we focus on adaptation, not prevention.
We thank the Prime Minister for his speech, and we'd like to call up the Leader of the Opposition. Hear, hear.
So if you heard the Prime Minister's speech and you thought very thoroughly, what you would realize is that he was actually not taking on a very big burden. It actually wasn't that different from the status quo. And the burden we're going to take on is the status quo. Within the status quo, yes, there are some efforts to a bit of adaptation, but that doesn't mean we have to abandon climate change prevention as a whole. We think they can go together. They need to prove us on their side of the house why we have to completely abandon climate change prevention and only go with climate change adaptation, and why there's such a serious demand. A lot of the things they pointed out were already happening within the status quo, so that actually goes on our side of the house. Now today, I'm going to be proving to you the burden, really, that there's more benefit from continuing with climate change prevention and maybe going a bit to, we're not saying we're not going to go to a bit of climate change adaptation in the future, but I'm going to be splitting this case up to you by firstly talking to you why there's incentive for change within the present and why it's already happening, and why there's going to be even more incentive for change within the future. And my partner's going to talk to you a little bit about climate change adaptation and how that won't really work so much as they seem to think. So let me first deal with what first member of Prime Minister said. So we first talk about the corporate level. He essentially gave you the idea that corporates and businesses don't have the incentive to participate in climate change prevention because it's not within their profit interest. And I'm actually going to be directly dealing with it within my case today, but essentially what I'm going to be telling you is that there's no dichotomy between the environment and economic success. We tell you they go hand in hand. We tell you environmental sustainability within a business goes hand in hand with long-term economic profit. I'm going to be breaking that down to you today. No, sorry, not at this time. Listen to my point. And then he also kind of said here this weird thing about the regular people. And he essentially told you that the regular people, you know, they don't have much interest because it's really slow and gradual, but we didn't really understand how that was really pointing towards his side of the house. And my partner asked a POI saying, okay, so if they don't want to do anything, why are they going to all of a sudden do something about climate change adaptation? And what he conceded is that, and he almost contradicted himself, is that actually people are going to start doing things. So we think on our side of the house, yes, they are going to start doing things, but it's going to be for climate change prevention.
Sir.
So let me get into my case. No, sorry. So let's look at firstly how there's incentive for change within the status quo and how change is happening. So in the last 10 years, ladies and gentlemen, we've seen a 70% increase in usage of green technology. Countries like China, ladies and gentlemen, who is known for its terrible, terrible smog, are starting to allow protests. They allowed their people to protest on environmental matters. We've seen governments starting to shift their paradigms. No, and we've seen, people are developing new technologies, new green technologies. More and more people are driving Priuses. We think there's already incentive for change. Why? Well, I told you already, I'm going to tell you how it's within economic self-interest to actually develop long-term to actually develop green technology. Why? Because green technology ensures long-term economic stability. A lot of these countries are based off of natural resources, and in order to achieve stable produce, and be able to have profit in the long term, they actually need to develop on environmentally sustainable practices. For example, if you're a farmer, ladies and gentlemen, you can't just use up all your topsoil, or else in the future you're not going to be able to grow crops anymore. You're not going to be able to make profit. I'll actually take you.
If you are a farmer and you know that your crops will end up 200 years after you die, will you really care about sustaining the environment? No, you won't. Therefore, we need to adapt, not prevent.
Okay, well, what we tell you is that yes, our burden on this side of the house is that we might have to adapt a little bit in the future, but you have to really prove to us why we can't continue with climate change prevention right now. We also see that the biggest polluters right now within the status quo are countries such as Canada, Russia, and China. And we think it's within their self-interest already, because sea levels are rising and they all have sea borders, that they already do things within the status quo. That's why we think there's already incentive for change within the status quo. We see, and we see more and more people are starting to accept. A big problem in the past was that people didn't even accept climate change. But as more and more scientists are affirming the realities of climate change, it's becoming more and more harder for people to deny it, and we see incentive for change. So why is there going to be even more that incentive for change to go towards climate change prevention in the future? Why? Because we see that kids are being educated more and more about climate change today. The future generation is going to be even more informed. They're going to be even more willing to address climate change, try and prevent it, not just adapt. We see oil prices are rising, ladies and gentlemen. And what we've seen with oil prices rising is as they rise, we've seen a growth in green technology. We think they're going to continue to rise. It's going to continue to affect people in the future. And here's my main layer of analysis. Why don't people, do things within the status quo as much as they could? Because it's for pragmatic reasons. But as the problem worsens, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to actually see much worse problems. It's going to actually affect civilization when large parts of land that are already being used can't be used anymore because the sea levels will rise. So they're going to have to stop hiding from the problem due to their, pragmatic reasons. They don't like driving Priuses. They're going to have to stop. We're going to see governments shifting. We tell you that, and we also tell you why have so many countries not shifted to economies based off green technology within the status quo? Because the big countries within the global market, ladies and gentlemen, the countries like China, the countries like the US, weren't on, didn't have economies based off of green technology. And what did that mean? Well, if a country like South Africa tried to shift to green technology, then China would completely outcompete it, undercut it because it's cheaper. But as these countries shift, that's no longer going to exist. We're going to see more economic self-interest even within the future. We're going to see more people shifting to climate change. And ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, we think within humans' history, we faced a lot of adversity. We don't want to just accept our fate, lose hope. We want to continue to try and fight and prevent the problem that's at hand. We want to continue with climate change prevention, and that's why we're so proud to oppose.
We thank the Leader of the Opposition for his speech and would like to call up the Deputy Prime Minister.
Okay, so firstly, before I go into rebuilding and rebutting my own case, I just want to address my very own burden of proof. Now, I must say that I'm taking on a very strong burden of proof that is completely different to what the status quo is. In the status quo, legislation and people focus on prevention. They focus on using green technology because they think, and companies do this too, focus on using green technology because they think they will produce less carbon or CO2 emissions, and they think that thus they will exacerbate the climate change problem. They do not think about the time after this threshold of irreversible time will come. They do not buy green energy powered cars because they are thinking of how they should adapt after this threshold comes. No, our entire world in the status quo is working on prevention. I am proposing adaptation, something completely different. So on to rebuilding my case. Now, firstly, I have 2 points here. Firstly, they talked about how economy and environment actually can go hand in hand. But I say no, this is completely wrong. Because green energy, green cars, and as corporations using green energy, this is much less cost efficient. It costs a lot more, and this is something companies do not resort to in the status quo, especially in countries like they outlined, they are the highest CO2 emitting countries, such as China, such as India, because what do we see there? We see a new flourishing in capitalism, we see a new flourishing in a lot of startup businesses, and startup businesses like a new airline in India will not start having planes that are green, that follow green fuel, or that go against climate change. No, they will try to get the cheapest plane so they can penetrate the global market as fast as possible. So we see that no, economy and sustainability does not go in hand. I'd say the opposite. We see an continuously exacerbating problem where no thank you, where the economy just halts green development. And secondly, they talked about that they didn't really understand my point about regular people, and therefore didn't really rebut it. So I'll just reiterate it because it's very important. Now, I said that the environment, climate change is so slow that normal people do not notice it. But who notices it? It's the scientists that work in the field. It's the people that work in the field. And if the people can't notice it, and if the people won't notice it until there's this threshold where the entire environment will completely change and will be no way back, they'll still not notice it. And I say they won't know. If they do not notice it, it is just the scientists that notice. And therefore the scientists should work on adaptation, because when this threshold ends and the people actually notice it, the scientists can't just leave the people die not knowing what to do in the new environment the world is, in the new climate change the world, if you will, in the new way the world is. The scientists that actually are noticing the climate change have the responsibility to prepare society and the people for the way it should work when this threshold comes. Do you agree?
Yeah. If the people are not listening to the scientists on prevention right now, why would they listen to them?
No, I'm not saying they'll listen to them. They obviously won't listen to adaptation either, because they do not see the steps within the environment. The scientists are those that notice it, and the people will notice it when we reach this threshold, when they will see huge increases in temperature, huge increases in sea level, and then they'll think, oh, what do we do now? What do we need then? We need scientists that are prepared to help these people out of this situation. And they won't be prepared if they focus their entire lives on prevention that has then failed. They need to focus on adapting the environment and adapting the people on how they should live when this threshold comes. Therefore, we need to focus on adaptation. Now on to my 2 points of rebuttal. Firstly, they say that China is trying to make a change and is working for the better. Now I say this is empirically false. Why? Because what is polluting in China is not the government. It's all these startups we see, all these capitalistic companies that start up there and try to use the cheapest means of production. Now, whatever the government tries to do against this is so small in comparison to this huge emancipation of capitalistic economy and capitalistic CO2 emissions that we see within the country. So whatever China doesn't work. And we see this in the real world. The legislation of China is not working. And even though they might seem propagating that the pollution is going down, it really isn't. And finally, they say that it will put the Earth into a, if we do not focus on prevention, essentially soon it will put Earth into a state that will never work again, and we'll lose a lot of land. So I say I'd rather be prepared for when that time comes, and I want my scientists to have focused on how I should adapt when that time comes, not to then say, oh, we've been focusing on prevention all the time, oh, it failed, what do I do now? I do not want to be in that situation. I'd rather have them adapted. Okay, so moving on to my final point of substantive, and this is about how the more we focus on prevention right now, the more we're actually exacerbating the problem of climate change. Now, climate change moves around a curve, and once we reach a point on this curve, we'll never be able to go back. This point is estimated to be within 20 or 25 years, when the methane reserves in Siberia dissolve and get up. Now, where's the problem here? The more time we spend on trying to prevent this. Now, I have to remind you that in the political spectrum and in the political domain, no thank you, climate change is very debatable. We are not, we're not just unilaterally or just everyone together homogeneously going against climate prevention. No, that's not the case. It goes through a lot of debate, and climate prevention is also ineffective in the political domain. No, thank you. So all the more time we spend on this, and all the more debate we spend on this, we lose time in trying to adapt towards an end that is coming. Moreover, I say that green energy and green energy manufacturing, green energy products cost a lot more to be produced and have a much higher cost to be able to be affected and to put into production. And actually, every time such a greenhouse product or a green product or green energy product is made, we are moving closer to that threshold of how climate change will be irreversible. Why? Because if we do not focus on the technology we have right now and try to adapt for it, if we focus on more preventive technology, more complex technology, it will just take more resources, it will take more energy that is needed to come up with, and it will move us closer to this threshold with actually working for the other purpose. So we see that it will have the backlash purpose. We see that the more we work on these very costly and green energy products, we see that we're actually moving closer to the threshold. On the other hand, I say that we should focus on using the technology we have now, not spend more time debating whether it's right or wrong, not spend more time trying to developing a good preventive measure or good preventive technology, because it is very costly. I say we focus on adaptation, because that threshold is coming, and we do not want to be there faster than we otherwise would, because we want to have as much time as we want to adapt for when that time comes. And so when the sea levels are rising, when the temperatures are increasing, we want the people to know what to do, and we want the scientists to be knowledgeable about how they should adapt to society, not knowing what to do, thinking they were preventing it while not doing anything at all. And therefore, we have to focus on climate change adaptation.
Give one instruction.
Ladies and gentlemen, what is the world of Team Sweden today? The world that we see is, regardless, in a couple hundred years, what we will see is a barren land that is completely uninhabitable, that has no more humans left because everyone died. Ladies and gentlemen, that is the long-term on-side proposition today. And on-side opposition today, we think that on our side of the house, we ensure that we can try to keep the survival of the human race going for as long as possible, instead of just ignoring the problem that exists. So let's get into the rebuttal, and then I'm going to go into my final constructive point. But before that, let's just get into some quick refutation. First of all, let's talk about the burden of proof. Because we think Team Sweden has been focusing on something that doesn't necessarily win them the debate. They've been showing us so far that climate change is irreversible. But really what we think they need to show us is which solution creates more benefit and creates more change, and which side can actually ensure that climate change is lessened. On our side of the house, it's not our burden to prove that climate change prevention will get rid of climate change 100%, although that would be ideal. Well, our burden is to prove that climate change prevention will, as a whole, benefit the world a lot more than climate change adaptation. We haven't seen a lot of that comparative analysis. They've really just been talking about why it's irreversible. We think they need to actually talk about the realities of climate change prevention, on how that will decrease CO2 emissions, and that will decrease the problems we see as a whole. So first of all, let's get into the first point that they talked about, this idea about ethically why we need to change. First of all, they really started off by talking about, companies and how, they're often lobbying a lot. Companies lobby in a lot of areas. Companies lobby for smoking, companies lobby for a lot of things. But when there is a will for government to put even more pressure on them, we think those lobbyists eventually fail. We don't think that's practical on their side of us to say that lobbyists will always win. We think that lobbyists in a lot of the cases don't end up winning. We think that's just an assumption on their side of us. Secondly, they talked about people. They said that they wouldn't really comply with these kinds of prevention changes. First of all, on our side of the house, we think that in the same way they wouldn't comply with adaptation, and this is where they said, they don't need to comply with adaptation until the problems already exist. So ladies and gentlemen, are you telling me that they only need to comply when their cities are getting flooded? They only need to comply when they're dying of heat. We think that by the time that it's too late, we think that they need to comply in an earlier time for this adaptation to actually work. No, thank you. They can't just comply when it's actually happening, because then it's really hard to change their lifestyle. It's really hard to move them to another place, because it's just something that's needs to be done for a long period, but it's really hard to do that really fast. Additionally, what we would say is that they talked about why on a corporate level we would change. First of all, they pretty much talked about the entire time of why corporations wouldn't comply with the government, well, why corporations don't really have an incentive for the environment. So we don't understand what they mean by on a corporate level. But in addition to that, I'm going to be talking about in the second point about why they're talked about empirically we should be changing. So they really talked about scientists and why they need to focus on a different thing. First of all, what we would say is that a lot of scientists already specialize in the area of adaptation, right, in the status quo. Seed banks that they talked about, in Oslo, Norway, there's a seed bank with hundreds of thousands of different species of seeds that can work for specific different climates. We think that already exists. The thing is, you don't need global attention to have seed banks. You need global attention to prevent climate change. You don't need global attention to prevent the methane gas problem in Siberia. You need Siberia to work on that issue by themselves. But we don't think we need to focus all of our resources on it. Ladies and gentlemen, we think as a whole, you don't need all the resources in the world to eventually store seeds or do things like that. We think that really needs to be going into prevention, and we think having more focus on prevention is much more beneficial than having more focus on adaptation. So we think because of that, let's get into some quick reconstruction. In the argument about how environment and the economy go hand in hand, they said that startup businesses are a really big thing. First of all, large fleets also probably are the ones that have the most emissions. They're the ones that already have most cars out there or airplanes out there. And we think these large fleets are changing their lineup, so they didn't address this issue. But secondly, about small fleets, we think small fleets will want to get a different market in order to survive. We see cars like mini cars, which are generally like a smaller business, but really focuses on electric cars to try to get the environment supporters on their side and get that different market. Sure.
That won't let them to penetrate the market. Organizations and companies like this do it after they've already penetrated the market. What about all those startups that actually want to get into the market and do not use greenhouse energy and just exacerbate the climate change problem?
You need to address my analysis about how these startup businesses will want to attract a different market, or go in with a different business strategy, or also just completely kicked out of the market because there's way too much competition. No, thank you. Oh, so let's get right into the third and final point on our side of the house about climate change adaptation. So I think this is a completely wrong paradigm to be taken, because what is climate change eventually going to do? If you focus on climate change adaptation, you won't be reversing the possible effects of climate change. So we think things like hole in the ozones will become much more common. So UV rays will come down and start killing people much more often. And we think that will be a huge problem that will get even worse. And we think that rising sea levels will keep on happening, and eventually more of the world will be flooded. And eventually we think heat will grow so high that it will make the world uninhabitable on their paradigm. So we think eventually climate change will be the reason why the world will become extinct. So we think that when you adapt, it just tries to delay that consequence. It just tries to keep the human race surviving for a little bit longer. We think that's the wrong paradigm to be taken because people will become extinct on their side of the house. Curbing the actual problem doesn't actually solve it. On our side of the house, first of all, we think that this will eventually work. It's reversible. Because the reason why they think it's irreversible and why the current studies show it's irreversible is what it's saying is if the current trends continue, then it cannot be reversed. But we think the current trends aren't necessarily continuing, and we've proven that on our side of the house. But even if somehow it's not irreversible, we think the more you focus on climate change prevention, the more you will lessen the amount of CO2 emissions, the more you will lessen the rising sea levels, the more you will lessen the temperature that the world is going to go through. We think that is something that will eventually result in more long-term change that will be much more beneficial. But in addition to that, this will discourage countries to go along the route of green technology. A lot of companies, when they see that the world is focusing on climate change adaptation, will start taking away their smart cars and stuff, because they realize that that's something the world isn't focusing on anymore. They realize that that's something that isn't really popular anymore. So we think, as a whole, both pragmatically and principally, on our side of the house, we want to keep people on this earth, and that's why, since we're the patient ones, that's why we're so proud to be opposing it.
Thank the Deputy Leader of the Opposition, and we'd like to call up the Member of the Government.
Ladies and gentlemen, today's side opposition is sitting comfortably in their first world chairs, in their first world climate change aware chairs. And we believe that this is not the way that we should go about this debate. We believe it's time for side opposition to step off their high horse and admit that developing countries have just the same rights to be developed as the part of the world that is already developed. And because of that, we need to focus on adaptation instead of prevention. We on side second government believe that the efforts that have gone into prevention of climate change, first of all, had no effect whatsoever, and second of all, they actually put an unrealistic burden on the countries that are currently in the state of development, which is first of all not fair, second of all, it's a burden that they cannot cope with, and third of all, it's actually affecting their economy in a way that it renders lives of their people worse off than otherwise. And because of all of that, we believe that we should instead put all of our efforts from the West to the less developed world into the adaptation to the climate change. So what I will do in my speech is I will show you how the lack of political will has actually driven the situation as far as it is. And second of all, I will show you now how with adaptation there will be the political will to improve this. But before I go into that, let me just offer a quick point of rebuttal on the question that is posed from the side of the opposition, and that is, how is this actual prevention and adaptation mutually exclusive, okay? We see that actually what has happened for the past 30 years is that policies over the climate change were determined in politics. This means a lot of negotiations, a lot of agreement signing, and we see that for the last 30 years, all of the efforts have gone into the prevention of climate change. What we see has happened is that, first of all, it created a sort of a smokescreen. It created a feeling for the Western countries that they're actually contributing, that they're actually improving the problem, and it didn't actually help much, okay? There were a lot of negotiations, there were steps back and steps forward, but we haven't seen actual effect on the climate change, on the CO2 emissions. And because of that, we've seen that this was just a big smokescreen that was just created as a facade for the people to believe that something is going on. Second of all, we see that this is actually eating up political power, political leverage, diplomatic power and leverage, and we see that because of that, we should just simply take away all those efforts that were put into it and just continue with simple adaptation. And thirdly, we see that it's very hard in politics to argue for either one of the possibilities where there is another one present, okay? And we see that as long as we have the possibility of adaptation present and the countries are aware of it, then nobody will opt for the prevention. And this is yet another reason why prevention hasn't been so successful, but I will go into this in my further analysis. So because of that, we believe that we should just simply drop the other possibility and push the success of the adaptation so that we can just help the country.
But
Okay?
ma'am,
No, I haven't even started yet. Okay, so first let's talk about the lack of political will. We see that there has been a significant lack of political will to improve the climate change with prevention, and this happened both on the level of the developed world and the developing world. What we have seen in the developed world, and this directly addresses the point of the first opposition when they asked me that we are just making assertions that nothing has changed. We see that actually all of what is happening, all of the policies that are made are heavily dependent on countries' economies, okay? Economies that are very strong, like conglomerates and corporations that are actually the cause of a lot of CO2 emissions. We see that because they have such strong lobbies, the government's decision and the policies they make are very dependent on those lobbies. We see that what has happened is that, for example, there was a cap and trade proposition in the United States that has failed in the Senate because the lobby of the corporations was too strong. We have seen the European Union has significantly in the past couple of months and years cut back on their emissions suggestions for their reducing of the CO2 emissions. We see that Australia never even signed the Kyoto Protocol. So we see that in the developed world there is very little incentive in politics to actually do something tangible, and because of that we see that because we've learned that only getting negotiations so far to fail, we should just drop them and go with another strategy. We see that also in the developing world, there is very little incentive to actually apply any of this. We see that because, and this addresses like their point about how is economy really mutually exclusive with ecology, okay? We see that there we have fast developing economies, now thank you, such as Brazil, Russia, China, India, the BRIC economies. We see that those are fast growing economies. They're very dependent on high energy production and high energy consumption. And those are all very much coal-based industries. We see that they are either very heavily industrialized or their farming is very heavily industrialized. And because of that, we see that they need a lot of energy resources, but the resources that are like energy, the resources that are clean and that do not further enhance the global warming are very expensive. We see that the reason why China opted for coal economy, and again I'm also addressing them, because we see that even though China has a little bit increased their green energy production, still like 90% of China's economy is based on coal. Okay, and the reason of that is because coal is very accessible to them and it's very cheap, and this is the way that they can drive their fast-growing development. We see that those countries, because of the way their economies are shaped, they believe that they have a political right, just a second, sir, a political right to opt out of this, and because of that, we see that we will never achieve the political will of those countries to actually opt into those kind of agreements. Go, sir.
Ma'am, yes, these are largely coal-based, but we've also seen that there's 3 different technologies now that greatly decrease the emissions from the coal. So should we just stop doing this innovation to stop the pollution?
Okay, in those countries, it's all based on the ratio between how much input you need in order to generate profit, okay? And we see that because of that, those countries will always opt for something that generates their development because they are in the state of development. In order for them to provide a decent lifestyle for all of their citizens, no thank you, they need to sustain their rapid development and in order to be competitive on the market. Now let me talk about how this adaptation will change the political will in the third world. We see that a lot of what has happened is already irreversible. We see that sea levels are up, temperature is up. For example, sub-Saharan and Saharan dynamics have definitely changed. And the parts of the countries that will be most affected by the first imminent consequences of the climate change are going to be the developing countries, are going to be countries that have cities that have low infrastructure, that are on the seashore, that are ports to the international trade. We see that first of all, this is going to drive the third world countries to cooperate in the adaptation process because their most strategic trade parts will be very heavily affected. We see that also that leaders in innovation and technology is still the first world, and we believe that because of that, it's the moral responsibility of the first world countries to push for this adaptation. We see that first of all, we have to admit that we had a chance to develop, and we developed largely on the expense of the third world and on the environment. And because of that, we believe that we have moral responsibility to now push for this adaptation technology. Second of all, we believe that it's unfair and hypocritical of the first world countries to just demand of the third world countries to give up their rights to be developed in order for them to cope with to prevent global warming. And thirdly, we believe that people in the third world countries have an intrinsic right to achieve the same standard, and we should let them develop in their own pace, but instead focus on the adaptation technologies. And because of that, we beg to propose.
I'd like to call up the member of the opposition. You're here.
Tesla asthma. So hold on to this. Okay. Okay, let me first point out that the team proposition has made a fatal mistake. They've never pointed out why adaptation works. Something that needed to be in their case, and I will now outline how it will never work. But firstly, let me get into some rebuttal. I'll focus on 3 points why climate change can still work. They focus on companies, people, and the government. I'll first go on to the companies and why they will use renewable energy and will adapt. Okay. So what we said, there was incentive to actually change, and we see that there is incentive. Well, if we, for example, see that 10 years ago, to make a battery that could actually run a car, it would cost around 500 times more than it costs today. We have such rapid increase in innovation in battery technology that we can actually make it happen. We actually have the Tesla S model that can now run 500 kilometers on one battery. We never saw this before. This is great. This is the kind of innovation that actually drives companies forward. There is no more rapid innovation in all companies. However, in renewable energy, it's the greatest type of innovation that we can see. We see battery technology going forward. We see renewable energy going forward. Windmills, everything is becoming more productive. And this is huge incentive because now we actually get energy that is more profitable than buying coal and buying oil because it comes out of the sky, people. Okay.
Sir,
go.
Is this a viable alternative to the existing modes of producing energy? Are we going to be able to substitute coal plants in the next 50 years or not under your plan?
Well, after 50 years we won't even have any more coal, so we better start doing it now. Okay, so we have nuclear energy, for example, that can power us for another billion years. Uranium in our Earth is enough to do that, and we can see that we have the technology. So we have the technology to get energy, and if I were Brazil, I would start doing it right now because they don't have enough oil to actually go on. The fracking, the new technology, won't have enough to actually drive us forward for another 50 years. Yes, it's a nice little bit of oil, but it won't actually provide for us in the future. What you need, because you need a shit ton of energy to actually get us adapted to climate change, as I'll point out. So yeah, companies will do it. Governments, we see a huge amount of political change. 6 years ago, we were still under George Bush. He didn't even believe in climate change. He tried to fight it constantly. Now we see Obama believing in it and trying to drive forward bills. So we're still in the first process of actually stopping climate change. Because we've had politicians that didn't know anything about it and tried to be with the religious people and tried to actually, do nothing. What we see, however, in Europe is that we actually have known about climate change because we're smart there. And we see that there is the largest amount of subsidies, is the largest amount of electrical cars, the amount of plugs on the street. People are actually using it the most there because we've seen the most political attention there. So we need to get the political attention all over the rest of the world. And we see it's also in China because they also have a huge amount of pollution and people are dying because of it and they don't like it. So what do? They start inventing technologies that can actually stop coal from producing NO2, which is grainy forest rain that causes acid rain. So we see that's going away. And governments are actually adapting, which is exactly what we need. And then the people will come, because as the government actually adapts, so will the people will finally have to. We'll see these subsidies for electrical cars. Tesla is the largest growing car company, the only growing car company in the world right now, because they have electric cars, and people realize that they're cheaper, and they're trying to use them.
Sir?
No, thank you, sir. Okay, now, onto my substantive on why climate adaptation will never, in 100 years, ever work. Okay, no, thank you. Eva, you love the developing world so much, well, you're going to kill them all. Right now, 20 million children die every year of hunger. No, thank you, sir. What do we see under their model? We see 2 degree average climate rate, increase in temperature. What will this do? It will greatly destroy a lot of the plants on Earth. Greatly, even more so in the developing world, because it's so hot there. 2 degrees average increase means that it will rise around 5 degrees there. Plants cannot adapt to this. We might as a people, but plants do not. And we don't have plants. Okay, go.
Right now they don't, but if we focus our attention on adaptation, on creating plants that will work in such environments, then the developing world will survive. Unlike in your plan, when everybody dies.
Well, then you might start making a crop that can actually survive underwater for around 5 years. You can't do this right now. This technology is extremely far from the future compared to the technology and renewable energy we have today. We have batteries that can do this. We do not have plants that can survive underwater. We do not have plants that can survive fluctuating weather patterns, tornadoes. We do not have plants. Yeah, try making a plant that can survive a tornado. I dare you. Okay. So what we see that happens under global warming is the depletion of the ozone layer, greatly stopping all photosynthesis. We see an increase in sea level, making plants go under, and developing world too. We'll see them getting greatly affected by it. And climate adaptation is something that happens on the spot. You have to build a bubble for yourself. However, you cannot build a bubble around the world. However, climate change, if we stop it, we'll stop it everywhere. That's the great thing about it. We're not going to help the developing world by actually helping them like adapt to their little environment. No, but if we stop everywhere, which climate change does, we can actually make a difference everywhere. Okay, so we also have acid rain, greatly depleting all crops that we have on the earth. We have fish having to adapt to thermal rays in the water, which they can very badly do. They cannot live in water that's way too hot. It just doesn't work for fish. They have to have the right amount of oxygen in the water, and the oxygen level changes in the water as the heat in it increases. So no, fish won't survive either. We have no food, and definitely your developing world, we have absolutely no food under your planet. Okay, so now, why can it still work? And why is there still hope? Well, because it's very slow, as Team Proposition already pointed out. We're only at the very beginning at the moment, and we can still stop it. We only see a 2% increase, not 2 degrees. So we're still far from the point where we see that there is a curve, but we're still in the beginning of the curve. We're not yet on the top, where it is irreversible. No, thank you, ma'am. We still see that there's only a small hole in the ozone layer, and that's not the biggest. We can actually see that also the ozone layer can build itself up, if given enough time. Yes, so if we start now blasting it with our CFCs and we're breaking it down, that will actually increase the ozone layer. But if we stop it now, it can build itself up. We also see that climate change and the increase in temperature is reversible. As volcanoes, for example, put in particulates into the air, they increase the temperature below it. We saw this in Europe after the volcano eruption in Iceland. We saw that the temperature went down greatly in Europe, and that is still going on today. So, what we see is that it's still stoppable at the moment. We only have a 2-meter increase in sea level, not a 10-meter, which it will be at the end of climate change, when actually everything will not survive. We have renewable energy, as already pointed out. We have everything in our power today to make this work. We just have to make it work. All Team Proposition as being lazy. We're saying we're too lazy as humans. We cannot adapt to it. However, we have the technology and we've been working on it. This is the year of the most renewable technology we've ever seen in human history. We've seen the most scrubbing technology. They actually cleaned their coal of having CFCs and O2s going into the air. We see oil and cars being more clean than ever, even though they're still burning on coal, on gasoline. So we see that the technology is there. We see that prevention is completely impossible, and we'll make sure that it will cause a life not worth living. And we see that we win.
We find a member of the government that would like to call up the opposition whip speaker. Here.
Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed panel, it always comes down to this. Passionate speakers on one side that might be convincing, but then on the other hand, you have the government that has the facts, that has the logic, that has the reason, and should have the weight in this debate. So what is going on today? Now, what we have to do today, and what the government is proposing today, is that we stop clinging to this senseless hope, this pipe dream of preventing climate change, and fulfill our call as a government to ensure our way of life for generations to come. And this is what we've shown you throughout this debate, that what they cling to is a senseless hope, but what we bring you is life in 2200. This is what we're doing, right? But before I go on to my two substantive points, basically how prevention has failed and will always fail because of the incentive structure, and what is right for the entire world, the developing and the developed world, let me give out 2 points of rebuttal, and the rest of it will be interwoven. Now, firstly, how will adaptation work? We've been challenged as to this. Now, what And it's true what he's saying. We need some magical technology here. We need seeds that can grow underwater. We need seeds that can grow under 40 degrees centigrade to grow, right? But this is exactly why we need to focus on these technologies. These are difficult to develop. This is what we need. If we have the technology and the know-how and the political will to develop these magical batteries that power the Tesla cars, why not, I ask you, why not have the tangible technologies that will save our world in the future? And how is their plan solving for anything, ladies and gentlemen? It does not. They do not present us with a viable alternative. These technologies that they kind of espouse here, the green tech, the Tesla cars, all of those things, these are sexy, sure. They turn heads, sure. I mean, Tesla is a really hot car. But what actually happens is nothing, very little. We might enjoy the reading about these technologies in the newspapers, but the impact of these is zero. And this brings me nicely to my first point, how prevention has failed and will always fail. Firstly, what are the results that we've seen from over 40 years of focusing our political and technological attention on prevention?
Sir.
Thank you, sir. We've seen, and what we would like to see here is a little less conversation and a little more action, please, right? We've seen Kyoto Accords fail, and these were and are the last chance that we had politically to come to some sort of a consensus in the world. Yet, these sorts of talks always remain this big smokescreen. They kind of allow us to cling to this hope without realizing the reality that we have at hand. None of the great polluters have implemented effective policies such as cap and trade, such as carbon taxing. None of these, despite 40 years of focusing on these, have actually begun to solve the problem, to diminish the carbon emissions. We have seen irreversible changes, and we have these irreversible changes in the climate on our hands right now. The 2% change, the melting of the West Antarctic ice shelf. We are seeing these changes now, and we need to have policies that are going to help us right now. Why are they always going to fail? Because of the incentive structure, ladies and gentlemen. We have prevention that is extremely expensive for corporations. Because we have higher entry costs to markets. Because we will always have corporations that value profits over being sustainable, looking sexy. Because we will never have a fair competition in this market. And this is why corporations will never sign up to their plan. But adaptation is much more appealing. It adds to their business models rather than subtracts, right? Prevention is not also appealing to developing countries. Now going to that a bit further. And prevention always fails to capture the imagination of our public and our politicians. Even the European Union, even the EU, the foremost actor in the global stage on climate change prevention, is taking steps backward, is realizing the truth that prevention is not going to work. And because we have these lobbies of the corporations, because prevention is not sexy to any of these players, we will never have prevention really working. But what is right for the entire world? What is the way to the future? The developing countries will continue to develop, and we on the side of the government feel that they have a right to develop, they have a need to develop, and they have an obligation, an obligation to their people, no thank you sir, to develop. Their incentives are poised at the most possible development at the lower cost. And this is why they go for coal, this is why they go for fracking, this is why they go for liquid nitrogen, for liquid gases. But before that, yes?
This is exactly why development in these renewable resources is something that's really beneficial. If electric energy becomes much more cheaper, then car companies would naturally turn to this because it's a much more cheaper alternative and makes them much more
profitable. Of course, sir. This is a perfect plan for 2150, but by then, half of the world will be underwater. The average temperature will be like 5 degrees higher, so on and so forth. So it's not viable right now, and we need a solution right now.
Sure.
So basically, no thank you. So what these developing countries need is help. Help of development to fulfill the needs of their people for services, for jobs, for economic growth. This is in their interest, this is what they want, this is what they will always want, and this is their obligation to the people. And the West has played a great part in creating this problem, ladies and gentlemen. Climate change is hitting the developing countries more than it is hitting the developed world, and will continue to do so. So what we need to do today is take responsibility for the situation at hand. We need to realize the incentive structure. We need to realize that the developing countries have a right, have an obligation to develop. And we need to help them develop technologies, develop structures that will help their populations to prosper in the future. Their populations and our populations, likewise. They need an ensured food supply in this new globally climate change world. They need security, they need water access. And for that, ladies and gentlemen, because of that, we need to finally drink the Kool-Aid, ladies and gentlemen. We need to face the music. We need to realize that climate prevention has failed, and it will always fail. And this is why we need to turn to what works, what will ensure our civilization in the future. And that is adaptation. Thank you very much.
We'd like to call up the closing or the opposition whip to conclude this debate as a whole. Here, here.
Save the planet on it.
CO2.
Team government today seems to agree very much that they're going to be living in the short term. They say, okay, we will have coal for 50 years and then we're going to run out. They seem to agree on this fact. But what we ask outside the house is, what happens then? What happens then when actually we're completely overflooded and we don't actually have any coal, any resources like that? Then what happens to developing countries? Well, they're also going to be affected by this. And that is why, on our side of the house, we stand for long-term renewable energy. And that is why we should stand for prevention instead of just adapting to these things. Now, in my speech today, I'll be covering three things. First of all, the idea of climate change. Secondly, prevention. And thirdly, adaptation. So let's jump right into the first one, climate change. And here I'll be covering, first of all, how far along it is, and secondly, how far along it can go, as my extension speaker talked about. So right now we only see, a small percentage. We see generally a 2% increase in temperature. We see, a small hole in the ozone layer that can still be able to build up. On their side of the house today, they're just going to go to continue, as my extension speaker said, blasting loops with CFCs, completely destroying the ozone layer, things like that. We see they can still be stopped. It's not that far off. Furthermore, we see, right now we only have like a 2-meter increase in the water level. That would be like the height of the sea air of this tournament. That's not quite a lot, right? But this can still go on. This can go to, 10-meter increase in the water level, which is going to be the height of this building. This is going to be a lot harder to actually survive. So this is going to be this whole building. We can see, for example, this would be, the flooding of a whole country, of the Netherlands, completely overflooded. This is what it can lead to. This is why we need to prevent it now, not just completely go over. Anyone in the Netherlands will completely, we heard a lot, this whole idea of a threshold from government today. But we see this threshold is still somewhat far away, and we can still actually prevent it now, that's why we should be doing this. But if we actually let it go to this threshold, it becomes completely unadaptable, which will be coming further on. We see that if we actually want to survive, for example, in the Netherlands, after all of this has happened, we see you don't need to live in a bunker underwater, you need to have food for 200 years, and you will not really be able to do this. You won't be able to have plants underwater, as they've talked about. So we see that climate change can actually still be prevented now, and that's why we should do it. So now moving on to the idea of prevention. This is my second clash. And you'll be looking at two things. First of all, stakeholders analysis of the various people involved in this, and secondly, the idea of renewable energy or technologies. So on the stakeholders analysis, we're going to be first of all looking at the government, then the companies, and then the people. Right? So on the idea of the government, we heard from the closing government how first of all there was lack of political will, and secondly how it was unfair for the developing countries that we were doing this, right? So on the point of political will, we see that in their model, prevention is still going to be an option, and people are still going to be discussing whether they should be doing prevention or adaptation. So we see no change in their model. It's not like prevention is just going to be off the table suddenly under their model. People are still going to be saying, oh, prevention should still be there. They won't be able to pass policies as effectively to adapt. So that's still a problem under their model. This won't really change. Again, you won't be able to convince everyone about adaptation immediately. How will you do this?
Since we are the government, we are choosing to focus on prevention.
Yes, but you have the opposition right here that's going against this policy, and that is why it is not passing. We see that any argument you have on there on why prevention is not working on right now, we see that the same point will work for adaptation, right? Adaptation will not just pass through immediately. You want to convince all the politicians that now adaptation is the way to go, and now we will do this as a whole country will go towards adaptation. This is not going to work. We're living in the real world, right? So furthermore, we see that in just 10 years, we've actually seen a very large shift already moving towards prevention. My extensive speaker talked about this. We saw that 10 years ago, no one actually really recognized climate change. It was more a debate about whether climate change existed. Right now, we're having a debate about what we should do about climate change. We recognize that climate change is a problem, and now we're looking about what is the best solution to this. We saw the change, for example, from Bush completely denying climate change to Obama actually trying to prevent it and do something about it. So we've already seen a political shift leading towards this. Now the only thing, now we see that government is just ignoring the extreme long-term effects that we'll get from it. So all we have to do now on our side of the house is that we actually have to convince the people that global warming can still be stopped, and there will be a lot more extreme effects coming from this. That is why we need to prevent and not adapt. Secondly, on the second point on how it's unfair for developing countries, right? They talk about how these countries, they have the right to become developed, that's why they have the right to use coals and technologies like this. Well, we see again that first of all, this won't really matter, because all of these countries is also going to be affected by all of these extremes. They will also be overflooded, they will also be affected by the holes in the air, also there's the acid rain and so on. So we see that it's better to prevent because that's going to actually help the global population, not just the developed countries. It's going to help everybody. So we see maybe we won't be able to actually pass these policies in all of these developed countries, developing countries, but we can definitely pass them into develop and try to do something to help the global population. That's what we stand on our side of the house today. We see that the flooding and the temperature increase is actually going to be very extreme. It's going to be as extreme in those countries. We see, an increase in maybe 4 degrees. It could be from 40 to 34. That's still going to be a lot. It's already a very uninhabitable environment. Now they're going to be completely uninhabitable. And if we don't stop it now, it's going to go to even more extremes, right? So we see that these environments are already unlivable. On their side of the house, they're just making it worse. And furthermore, as we had in our extension, we see that adaptation won't actually work because it's actually going to be hurting everyone, and that's why I'll be moving on to now, and why we actually take this debate. Yes?
For that. If they know all of this, then why hasn't prevention worked so far? We have this information, and yet we have seen no action.
As we've already shown you, we see it takes a long time for this to happen. We see, but we do see, as I already mentioned, a shift towards it, right? I already explained to you our analysis on how 10 years ago, we just completely ignored climate change. Today we actually recognize it and are debating about the best way to do this. So it will take time to actually move towards prevention, but we see that we are moving towards this. But now moving on to the second stakeholder, and this is the companies. And here we first of all heard how the corporations have no incentive, and second of all, how not all companies will do this. On the first one, we see that they actually do have a very clear incentive. Because if someone is able to today come up with a green technology that's efficient and so on, they'll actually capture the whole energy market, right? So companies, they have a very clear incentive to actually try to build these technologies. Because if you do invent a very renewable, cheap energy, people will be buying it. People will be into buying this. The only reason they get the other ones is because it's cheaper. So that's a very clear incentive to actually do this. Second of all, on the point of how not all companies will adapt, we see that if we first of all change the mind of the government, which already had analysis on how we will do, then these companies, through the policies that are passed by the government, will also be affected. Thirdly, on the people, we have a contradiction on the first government today. They talked about how people aren't trusting scientists now, but then we asked the people, well, why would they be trusting them on adaptation? We said people are not going to change it. Then they said, when they see these extremes, then they will be trusting. We said this is too late. When your house is already flooded completely, then it's too late to be trusting them. Secondly, on the point of renewable energy technologies, we talked about how renewable energy is an incentive to prove, and if we just wait for 50 years and so on, we will be able to move on and live normal. But second of all, as my extensive speaker asked in the PY, we saw no reason, we had no response on why renewable technologies wouldn't work. For example, making coal plants and so on more efficient, things like that, improve the efficiency of coal plants. We're going to have scrubbing in factories. We see, they said that governments wouldn't be doing this either, but this is what we stand for on our side. But now moving on to our extension and why we take this debate. And we haven't actually heard a response on our extension, how adaptation is not really going to work. First of all, we talked about how it's going to be very fluctuating extremes. We're going to see more natural disasters, we're going to see the ozone layer being destroyed, we're going to see acid rain, conditions that people can't possibly live in. But second and more importantly, we see no sustainable way of creating food on their side of the house. You may be able to hide yourself in a bunker, but you have no way of creating food. We see fish, they won't be able to survive the increased temperatures in water because of thermal pollution. We see the plants, because the ozone layer is destroyed, won't have any photosynthesis, so won't be able to survive. We see that crops will be destroyed by drought and flooding. We see that we won't actually be able to harvest underwater crops as they talk about. We see livestock won't be able to survive. So we can survive, we can hide ourselves in the bunker, but we will not have any long-term way of surviving, and that is why we oppose this motion today.